So welcome everyone to Beth Summers' Capstone presentation today. Just so everyone knows the format of what's going to happen, Beth's going to present for 25 minutes. Then we're going to ask questions from the committee. Once that's done, if there is still time, we can open up questions to the audience as well. At that time, we're going to ask you to we'll move you to another room on Zoom. We'll deliberate and then we'll come back and meet with all of you again and talk to Beth at the end. So Beth, if you want to share your screen, you are set to go.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dave. I'm just going to move the screen down here a little bit. All right, here we go. I'll make sure I'm all set. Yep. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being here today. I'm delighted to present to you my capstone research on how organizational communicators met the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic and the lessons we can take away from how they prepared, responded, and learned from this generational crisis event. First, I'd like to provide an overview of the agenda for this afternoon's presentation. I'll outline the purpose and significance of this study, as well as provide an overview of the literature that I reviewed. I'll describe my research process and questions, including my methodology. I'll walk you through a high-level summary of my findings, outline conclusions, limitations, and areas for future research. I'll review my key recommendations for practice, and I'll close the presentation with some brief acknowledgements before the question period. First, some context on this capstone study. The COVID-19 pandemic was a generationally significant crisis event and threat to human health. It created a state of chaos and disruption in all aspects of human life, and it's still without modern comparison with regards to the expansive and still evolving social, economic, operational, and financial impacts that organizations faced and required a rapid response to. They had to adapt to a completely new, unknown, and changing operating environment. This created an opportunity for communicators to step up and manage the internal and external flow of information, as well as identify and implement new ways to communicate and grow in strategic value for their organizations. Having worked through the pandemic and public health communications myself, I saw this as a unique opportunity to, my screen's moving here. I saw this as a unique and unprecedented phenomenon and as an opportunity to build on Dr. Terry Flynn's research on crisis preparedness, looking at how and to what extent organizational communicators perceive variables related to preparedness of their organization to successfully manage crisis, as well as how communicators contribute to crisis management before, during, and after the pandemic. In my review of literature, I outlined definitions and key terms related to crisis management and crisis communication, which helped to set the context for this research and frame our understanding of the pandemic as a crisis. This included key concepts of crisis management, crisis preparedness. I'm going to stop on crisis preparedness to break this down a little bit more. It will help provide some context to the explanation of my results later in this presentation. Crisis preparedness focuses on prevention by preparing for threats before they become a full-blown crisis, and it vastly improves outcomes when faced with a significant operational or business disruption. And it was here where I laid out the foundations and key criteria that best indicate an organization's preparedness for crisis. This includes both the implementation of 13 crisis preparedness principles, which are the tactical steps that can be taken within an organization, and include things such as the creation of a crisis communication plan, developing crisis scenarios, or training spokespeople, as well as the existence of 12 organizational crisis public relations management variables that have been tested to best predict an organization's degree of crisis preparedness. And this includes things such as having a multidisciplinary crisis management team in place, key stakeholders identified, and communications teams having the necessary resources and authority to manage crisis. I also looked at crisis communication, excellence in public relations, stakeholders in the context of crisis, the role of public relations as organizational communicators, and how excellence theory is applied to understand how communicators add value to their organizations through their strategic contributions, And lastly, I looked at crisis recovery and organizational learning. Into the research process. This study explored perceptions of crisis preparedness and the role organizational communicators played in crisis preparedness and management. Overall, I wanted to understand the degree to which the COVID-19 pandemic impacted crisis preparedness and the role communicators played within crisis response and management systems before, during, and after the pandemic. To answer the research problem, I looked at 3 key areas established through the literature and best practices in crisis communication. The first was preparation. I wanted to investigate the extent to which organizations were prepared for crisis at the onset of the pandemic. And I also wanted to explore the perceptions, role, and contributions of communicators to that preparedness. Looking at response, I wanted to understand how communicators contributed to crisis response during the pandemic. And looking at learning, I wanted to understand what the current status of crisis preparedness is within organizations today as a result of learning following the pandemic, and if communicators perceive their organizations to be any more prepared for crisis today than in March 2020. My research questions included how and to what extent were organizations prepared at the onset of the pandemic, and how did organizational communicators contribute to crisis preparedness before March 2020? How and to what extent organizational communicators contributed to crisis response, and what new strategies did they implement to manage the crisis response between March 2020 and May 2023? And how and to what extent have learnings been applied to inform crisis preparedness today? The research methodology included a comprehensive review of literature exploring the core concepts and best practices germane to crisis communication, an online survey which garnered 71 complete responses, 11 in-depth interviews with communicators from across Canada. The study was also bound to 3 key timeframes: on and before March 2020, between March 2020 and May 2023, and May 2023 to present day. And these timeframes were chosen because they aligned with key dates where the World Health Organization both declared and then downgraded the COVID-19 pandemic as a global health emergency. Now, to summarize my findings. Respondent demographics and characteristics included 71 survey respondents, largely working in management and senior level communication professional positions, representing 13 sectors, with the most common sectors being government, healthcare, and education. And 11 interview participants working in management and senior level positions represented 6 provinces and 7 different sectors, with the top 3 sectors including healthcare, education, and energy. To demonstrate the degree to which I was able to address the research problem, I'll be sharing a summary of my findings thematically by each research question. And to review, my first research question explored the perceptions of crisis preparedness from the viewpoint of communicators and sought to understand crisis preparedness at the onset of the pandemic and how communicators contributed to that preparedness. Results demonstrate that communicators perceive their organizations to be insufficiently prepared to manage the crisis posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. 30% of respondents report that their organization was neither prepared nor unprepared, and 23% report that their organization was unprepared for the crisis posed by the pandemic. Only 21% of respondents believe their organization was prepared for crisis in March 2020. And despite a majority of organizational communicators perceiving that most crisis preparedness variables were in place at the onset of the pandemic, less than half of survey respondents agreed that the communications team was absolutely ready at that time. It came to the tactical implementation of principles to prepare for crisis. Few of these principles were in place at organizations before March 2020. As you can see here, only 5 of 13 principles were in place at a majority of respondents' organizations pre-pandemic. And even fewer communicators contributed to these preparedness principles before the pandemic, with over 50% of respondents indicating they only contributed to 2 of 13 principles before March 2020. The second part of my survey and in-depth interview questions focused on the role communicators played within crisis response during the pandemic. Respondents were asked to think about how they contributed to their organization and what new strategies they developed and implemented to help support crisis response. Nearly 90% of survey respondents said they made significant contributions and managed the internal and external flow of information during the pandemic. The majority of respondents provided counsel to leaders, participated in strategic decision-making, and had influence on crisis response and management. Respondents established new processes and strategies to communicate with stakeholders, cultivated strong relationships, and were part of crisis management teams. And less than 50% of respondents reported that they had the authority to make decisions during the pandemic. Themes from my interview data demonstrated that pandemic contributions to crisis response included providing strategic advice and contributing to strategic decision-making, leading internal and external communication, and contributing to business continuity planning. Strategies implemented to manage the pandemic crisis response included over 115 comments from both survey and interview participants, ranging with themes from the development of internal and external communication strategies to public health communication strategies, crisis response, social media, stakeholder and government relations, and business continuity strategies. Aligning with the excellence principles in public relations and best practices in crisis communication, organizational communicators stepped up during the pandemic. They contributed significantly to a wide range of activities, as well as taking on new responsibilities, such as business continuity. The third research question in this study explored post-pandemic crisis preparedness and learnings through the perception of the organizational communicator. When looking at how the pandemic has impacted crisis preparedness today, communicators perceive their organizations to be more prepared for crisis today in March 2020. Communicators also perceive a greater number of crisis preparedness variables to be in place today within their organizations versus before the pandemic. As you can see here, a majority of respondents indicated that all variables are in place at their organization today versus only 11 of those variables in place before the pandemic. By measuring this again in present day, we see that communicators feel more confident in their organization and that it has learned from crisis to inform future preparedness. We also see the needle move very slightly on authority and resources to manage a crisis. However, this is only a very small difference from pre-pandemic, with a 4% difference in authority and a 5% difference in resources over the span of 3 years. Asked how their role has changed since 2020, 23% of respondents indicate they received a promotion and work in a more senior role, and 21% work in a more senior role, but at a different organization. 18% of respondents indicate that they either have a new role at a different organization or that their role remains the same, but with additional responsibilities. 10% of respondents indicate that their role remains the same today as it did in March 2020. This suggests that while communicators report slightly more authority over crisis preparedness, this work and influence is not necessarily recognized formally in their organization or within their current role, as less than 50% of respondents report receiving a promotion to a more senior role within their organization, where they may lead or have greater authority over crisis preparedness or more resources to manage this type of work through their team or departmental budgets. Further, while communicators report that they have more influence, responsibility, and decision-making authority over crisis preparedness today than they did in March 2020, when I measured how that response translates into practice, only 8 preparedness principles are identified by a majority of respondents as being in place today, and that's compared to 5 pre-pandemic. And over 50% of survey respondents report only contributing to 5 of those 13 preparedness principles today, and that's compared to 2 before the pandemic. Organizational learning is an imperative step within crisis management. While a majority of survey respondents report that their organization has embedded learnings from the pandemic and has learned from previous crises in general, 55% of interview respondents have identified learnings from the pandemic, but have not formally documented them. Interview participants described pandemic learnings to include many lessons learned in the areas of business continuity, crisis communication planning, internal communication, and relationship management. While 3 of these key themes align with the literature and best practices in crisis communication, business continuity really emerged strongly through all of my interview responses. And it particularly highlights for me that communications really expanded the scope of their practice during the pandemic, particularly as it relates to acting as a business function within organizations. These findings also suggest that communicators certainly understand the value of reflecting on learnings following a crisis, perceive that their organization has done so. However, there is better attention required to formally documenting these learnings. Crisis leadership within an organization is also vital to preparing for crisis and learning after a crisis. When asked how senior executive or C-suite engagement and commitment to crisis preparedness has evolved or changed since the end of the pandemic, 25% of respondents report senior level commitment to crisis preparedness has slightly increased. 21% report it has moderately increased, and 17% report it remains unchanged. This demonstrates that organizational leaders may be more focused on a return to operations rather than investing in or maintaining that crisis preparedness mindset into the future or in a post-pandemic world. Now on to conclusions and some areas for future research. Findings from this study demonstrate that organizational communicators played a pivotal role in helping their organization manage and respond to the COVID-19 pandemic in a number of key areas that align with the literature, excellence principles in public relations, and best practices in crisis communication. And while we are seeing movement towards greater influence over crisis preparedness and management, despite their significant contributions over a 3-year period, communicators are not actively participating in the tactical development of crisis preparedness principles today. And learnings from this major crisis event haven't necessarily been adequately recorded by communicators themselves or sufficiently across organizations. This also includes a lack of leadership engagement and commitment to crisis preparedness. So while this study shows marginal improvement in crisis preparedness after the pandemic, it's still not quite what we would consider the gold standard of communications participation in crisis preparedness, response, and management. Looking at some of the limitations of my study, a larger sample would have certainly been helpful to generalize my findings. I did not collect comprehensive demographic data in my survey to be able to report on perspectives from across Canada or the US. While cognizant of bias at the onset of this study, we know that certainly the possibility of bias cannot always be eliminated, and the limits of self-reported data may have also been a factor in this study. At times, there was some data that contradicted itself when I was analyzing the results. So while I did do my best to address this in reporting of the findings, it may have impacted reliability. And lastly, given the PR industry's efforts to increase diversity and representation among Canadian PR practitioners, since I didn't collect demographic or race-based data and only administered the survey in English, I can't ensure the diversity of perspective is represented in these research findings. Some areas for future research include targeting a wider sample and replicating the study to include communicators in the US. Additional research to understand the communication and pandemic contributions and experiences of racialized and BIPOC communications professionals is warranted to better understand each community and its experiences, as well as further study to look at the relationship between emergency management and communications and how these departments are resourced and function to support crisis within organizations. Based on the results of this study, I've summarized areas of success and areas that require improvement, providing 4 key recommendations to help enhance practice. These areas of success highlight where communicators made significant contributions in alignment with the literature and best practices in public relations excellence and crisis communication. Communicators made significant contributions through the development of new strategies to communicate with stakeholders and provide instructing information. They manage the flow of information internally and externally with a strong emphasis on comprehensive internal communication programs. They provided strategic advice and counsel to organizational leaders. They participated in strategic decision-making. Communicators also had influence on crisis response and management during the pandemic. They established new communication processes and channels to communicate with stakeholders. And they cultivated and maintained relationships with regulators, politicians, stakeholders, the public, and the media to advance organizational goals and objectives. Areas for improvement identify where contributions to crisis preparedness, response, and management could be enhanced. These include greater contribution to the development and implementation of crisis preparedness principles, more authority within organizations to contribute to crisis preparedness and make decisions during a crisis, greater commitment at the senior leadership level to crisis preparedness planning, better record keeping to document learnings in real time during crisis situations, as well as formally recording crisis learnings in organizational reports for future reference at the conclusion of a crisis. I arrived at 4 key recommendations to help enhance practice as a summary of these successes and areas for improvement, which include organizational communicators need to have more involvement in the development and implementation of crisis preparedness principles. Organizational leadership needs to better engage and commit to crisis preparedness. Greater delegation of authority to communicators to plan for and manage crisis is required. And I also recommend better documentation and integration of learnings to inform future crisis preparedness. These recommendations summarize the study's findings to help identify where and how communicators can more actively participate in crisis preparedness and management within their organizations. Lastly, I want to take a moment to describe some of the ways I plan to incorporate my findings into practice. I really saw this study as being near and dear to my heart, and certainly an opportunity to elevate the profession and highlight all of the valuable and strategic ways communicators contribute to their organizations. So first and foremost, I want to move forward with these findings and continue to share them widely, highlighting the value we bring to organizations, not only when we were called upon to do so during the pandemic, but also as we return to regular operations and demonstrate new areas we can contribute to, particularly as a business function. I want to share these findings with my network, colleagues, and across the MCM community, as well as through CPRS or IABC development sessions. I'd also look to submitting this research to relevant journals later this year. I also want to take a moment to thank and acknowledge the people who have supported, inspired, and served as a guiding light to help me get to the finish line of this degree here today. My husband, Alex, and in-laws, Kirk and Nancy, who are on here this afternoon, as well as my friends and family and amazing MCM 15 classmates. A big thank you to my supervisor, Dr. Terry Flynn, second reader, Dr. Alex Sevigny, and chair of my defense today, Dave Schultz, as well as the entire MCM faculty and instruction team who have been a source of wonderful mentorship and friendship over the last 2.5 years. I also want to thank my boss and colleagues at London Health Sciences Center who have been incredibly supportive and understanding of the time and attention required to complete this graduate education journey. Many of you are here to support me this afternoon, and I want to express my sincere gratitude to each and every one of you. And with that, I'll conclude my presentation and turn things back over to you, Dave, to facilitate any questions that the panel might have for me this afternoon.
Excellent. Well done, Beth. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Flynn, as her advisor, you get first go.
Well, thank you very much, Dave, and congratulations, Beth. That was a tremendous presentation, very thorough. I'd challenge the original research that you used as your basis for this. I don't think the guy knew what he was talking about, but be that as it may. I want to talk about that actually. And when you think about it, the research that was done for that study was 20 years ago this spring. And it set a benchmark for identifying the sort of foundation for crisis preparedness as well. What do you think has changed in 20 years?
Oh gosh, I think awareness of crisis preparedness has changed in 20 years. But when we look at those marginal improvements through the findings, I think there's a lot of awareness and a lot of acknowledgement of it, but that formal implementation into practice is where we still need to see improvements. So you were measuring this 20 years ago, Terry, and certainly, I looked at measuring it over the course of 3 years, and we still don't see that gold standard being achieved. We still don't see all of those principles achieved. So I think we all talk about it. We all know it's vital. We all say it's not a matter of if, but when. But we really need to kind of put our words to work, and we need to really dig in and implement that and see what we can put into practice to actually formally prepare our organizations.
So do you think we'll actually ever get to that gold standard where organizations overwhelmingly have all of those principles, or is it just human or organizational behavior that we don't really think is going to really happen to us? So we don't really take it to that, the 13th degree to be able to do it, because, it might happen to another hospital down the road, but it's not certainly going to happen to us, right?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a little bit of both. I think we see the incremental change through the results and findings from this study. So I think gradually we're all starting to say, aha, we're going to write this down, or I'm going to develop this document to reference for next time. But I would also say, particularly through the interviews that I had with respondents, this is a really different scenario that the pandemic posed. And many respondents describe that we actually came up with so many great strategies or so many great contributions that they weren't a file that we necessarily put on our shelf for crisis communications. They're actually a tool that we implemented into our regular practice and our regular workflow. So I think that might have both perhaps influenced my results, but I actually think it elevated our game to be crisis ready at any moment and every day. So, it's not in the textbook crisis communication plan on the shelf, but it's actually part of our everyday toolbox. So I think we've embedded a lot of those learnings from the pandemic that are just going to be part of our process going forward. And while it's not necessarily formally documented, I think that makes us, ready to go if and when it does happen.
Your findings allow for an opportunity to create some kind of audit or some tool for organizations to have a kind of quick reference point. How do you think that could be used for organizations to give them sort of just a touch point to know and understand where the organization's at?
Yes, well, you and I have experience in working and doing an audit together. So certainly I think that's something that I could look to continue to develop this year as I look to publish as well. And it's kind of that quick go-to reference point. And in one of my interviews, I discussed with a respondent, the pandemic was so big and there was so much going on in that moment. They really had to refer back to theory, and they really had to refer back to those textbook crisis preparedness principles. So kind of creating a tool or providing something that's a little bit more grab and go maybe could be created to allow those communicators, rather than the big book off the shelf or the big comms plan that no one has time to read, that checklist, where are your stakeholder lists? Where are your plans? Where is your team? Who are you going to call? And so I think that tool would be almost a quick grab and go to remind us in a chaotic moment, here are the 20 things we need to do in the next 48 hours. So certainly a tool I could look at developing to further distill this research.
Great, thank you. That's enough for me for this first round.
Oh, you might be on mute there, Dave.
I am, of course. Thank you, Terry. Alex, you're up.
Great, thank you very much. So congratulations on a really well executed MCM capstone. It was a pleasure to read. As always, your work is always so well constructed and so thoughtfully put together. So it's a pleasure to read it. And people who know me know I don't just say that. But the research was nicely done. It was a significant, a really good number of survey responses, really excellent quantity of interviews and in-depth interviews. So just thought I'd say great methodology. I had a question that came out of this that and it's kind of a not directly in your research, but it made me think about this. And maybe you'll speculate with me. What I felt happened during the pandemic, and I saw that in your work, is that crisis preparedness had a lot to do with communications. And so in terms of a takeaway for the profession and its institutional value and its value proposition within an organization, how would you summarize your findings and focus in on that? Like how do you think your study makes the case for the value of comms as a strategic management function?
Absolutely. I think the results of the research really summarize that it makes the case that the communicator sitting at that C-suite table, or having a C-suite, or having a seat at the table in general, provides kind of a full scope view of all of those variables that need to be considered at the onset of a major organizational or operational issue. So I think, it allows us to actually demonstrate the strength of our practice and how comprehensive it is in being able to provide guidance and direction on, here's what we need to say to stakeholders, or here's how we want to manage our reputation in the face of this issue, or here's how we want to respond or not respond in this scenario. And I think being able to demonstrate that communicators can jump in and contribute to business continuity planning, operations within an organization, and funnel through and support all the internal communication, or participate in some of those more what we would call textbook, maybe emergency management principles within an organization. But communications really demonstrated that it's that full scope business function that can step in and participate pretty much in any business line within an organization. So it allows us to really demonstrate that jack of all trades role that we play within organizations, and really kind of nicely packages that we're a profession that could be called upon to support in any situation. And the strategic thinking and guidance and the scope of our experience to consult on is quite broad.
Yeah, great answer. And I agree with you. Eloquently put too. And given that, if you could, I don't know, do you have your capstone open in front of you? Do you have a copy? You do? Yeah. Okay, if you go to page 43, that table, I know it's not in your presentation, but it's just such an interesting table, right? Where you say a summary of, just for the benefit of the audience, a summary of crisis preparedness principles in place prior to March 2020 and how organizational communicators contributed to this work. And then there's a sequence of principles. And so if you look at this list, oh yeah, you got it up. Great. Sorry, I was looking at my own file. So if you look at this list, it's fascinating. And this is one of the reasons I think your work is so interesting, because it's full of these insights that there's so much to unpack even within what you've done. So why is there this delta of did not contribute to work? Did that come out in your interviews, or maybe not directly, but did you infer anything about, why there'd be this, like, it seems to be a pretty standard 25 to 40%, maybe an average of 33% delta between like contribution and existence of a principle.
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't formally wrap my head around it, Alex, until I started to do my presentation after I had submitted my paper. So you know how we have to go through so many different phases in the research process to distill and understand our data. this actually came to fruition when I was really visualizing for the presentation. And I wonder in my mind if it's that correlation between who my survey respondents were, right? They're primarily those senior level communicators. So I started to make, I started to make the connection to think, maybe organizations delegate that more tactical contribution of the development of these principles to someone perhaps more junior. Or, and that's why my area for future research was, looking at emergency management and communications and how they work together or what they're responsible for. My brain started to go to, are these pieces of the puzzle that also, are emergency management departments within organizations? So those are two things that really stood out to me, over the last 2 weeks as I put my presentation together, and could have been certainly factors in why we see that difference here.
Yeah. Excellent answer and thoughtful, enlightening. Because I looked at that and I was like, so interesting. But yeah. Anyway, so that's it for me for this round. We can go to whoever Dave wants to go to next.
Thank you, Alex. Actually, I'm going to go to myself very quickly, and I'm going to follow up on a little bit of what both Terry and Alex asked you. So Alex was asking you, so that chart is pre-2020. And one of the learnings that you had was that there is only so much pandemic planning that's gone into existence or being continued based on the learnings, which people are maybe not taking from this. In your in-depth interviews, did you run into what are some of the barriers that are stopping people from taking learnings and incorporating what they've done or what they've learned into a plan for the future?
Yeah. Time and capacity. So that's
Really?
where my conclusion on resourcing comes from, because there was I experienced it in my own kind of pandemic return to operations experiences. As organizations, everything got downgraded, and then there was that push towards return to operations. So let's get back to doing the work we haven't done for 3 years. And so I think it was too much of a change and too much of a shift, and no time to really reflect. And it was really interesting in the interviews. A lot of people had commented on, sitting down with me or reflecting to prepare for an interview with me was actually the first time they gave their brain time and space to really meaningfully reflect on those learnings. So I really think that that's where that resourcing piece comes from, or that's where that delegation of authority comes from, where we would look to organizational leaders to say, part of your time is to reflect and embed these learnings and help contribute to organizational reports. So really making that commitment to making space within our roles to do that formal learning and to do those formal reflections.
Okay, thank you. 'Cause I'm a little more cynical than Terry. I don't think necessarily in 20 years, when you're on a Capstone committee for someone who's now replicating the work that you and Terry have both done, I don't know if we're going to see a lot of shift. And I think the shifts that you've seen within this, because you're measuring it right after a significant event, it's top of mind. I worry that it's going to go away again, and that we're going to slide back to pre-pandemic planning situation or scenarios. And so I don't have a question. I just want to say I'm glad to see that you have a plan to go out and talk about this, because I think people people in your capacity from an academic standpoint and a leader in the industry standpoint, that's who we need to be talking about this and reminding people that they need to do something with this over the next immediate time to be prepared for that. So thank you for this. Terry, I see you've taken your microphone off, which I'm going to assume means that you would like to add to this conversation.
Yeah, well, just to follow up what you talked about, David, I think it is human nature. I think it's human behavior that the farther that you get away from a pain point, the less that you remember that pain. And so your behaviors that happened before tend to follow suit again. It's like, when you not that I know anybody that might have gotten speeding tickets, but after you get a speeding ticket, you sort of follow the speed limit for a while. And then, you get a little bit more comfortable and you go further again. Same kind of thing, right? The farther away from the incident, the more likely that we're going to revert to a behavior. I also think just and this is a message to at least one organizational leader that is on this, right? And just what Beth talked about, this notion of enforcing learning. So that notion of reflection, this is the same thing that happened after Walkerton. You know what happened? You know what happened in terms of organizational learning after Walkerton? Zero. People picked up their computers, left Walkerton, and never talked about it again. There's not one volume of learning that took place from a collective basis, and yet there was the first time that a province that really had the opportunity to look at interoperability, right? All these different organizations. So I think you're right, Beth, in terms of forcing organizations to, and that might be in the resource at time, to document those learnings at the moment so they're captured so that people don't have to go backwards. There could also be some PTSD that's involved with it, that people don't want to go back, right? Don't want to go back and look at it and have that kind of commentary as well. So so the last question I have, Beth, is what would you do differently if you were to construct this study again at this moment? What would, knowing that the challenges of getting survey responses and survey responses from a more representative sample of the sectors that we focus on, what would you do differently in this constructing?
Yeah, I think, we always have these reflections at the end when we look at all the data side by side. So I did note those inconsistencies. I missed in my survey collecting some demographic data that I would have liked to have had to compare and measure against the excellence principles. So, looking at representation of women in leadership roles and how that might align with preparedness contributions, looking at the representation of racialized and BIPOC communities. I know that's, a real effort through CPRS and some of the studies they've conducted. So again, kind of being able to collect data to benchmark and compare to it, some of the goals of our industry would have been something I reflect on wanting to build into my survey. I also would have wanted to kind of align my survey and interview questions and mirror them a little bit more so I could kind of maybe use the survey and interview data to validate a little bit better. And then I think the last reflection, I probably would have, even though, we always attempt to scope as much as possible with these capstones, I probably would have scoped a little bit more. Once I got the data and was really trying to make sense of the results, I realized, I was measuring crisis or organizational communicator perceptions of crisis preparedness. I was measuring how prepared organizations were before, during, and after the pandemic. I was measuring crisis leadership. So I kind of took many variables in that best practice pot and tried to measure quite a lot of it. And so it made it quite difficult to really scope down the data in order to report it in a concise way. So those are some of the reflections I've had to date.
Great, thanks.
Okay. Alex, do you have another question?
Just a quick one. And that's, you've done a lot of work here that I think, exceeds the requirements of this of the MCM capstone, which is great. Congratulations on that. But I'd hate to see it not be used afterwards. So I mean, do you have plans for presentation and publication, or turning it, either on the academic side or on the executive training or professional development side for practitioners, or academic publications or other?
Yeah, truly, Alex, kind of all of those things. I think later this year, I want to really explore. I think there's certainly some value in exploring, where I can submit for publication and looking to some calls for that. And then also, yes, looking to see how I can continue to contribute to this area of work. A big thing we talk about is keeping it front of mind. Well, that means maybe I become the regular person on your LinkedIn feed where I'm posting and sharing these learnings with LinkedIn groups or with our community to continue to be that person talking about crisis preparedness and forcing everyone to keep it front of mind. I also think, I love the MCM community and I want to stay active in it. So I would love to come in, Terry, and, talk to your crisis class next summer and continue to, contribute to conversations in the MCM community space, as well as where and how I can present this either with IABC, CPRS, or more widely at conferences. But certainly it's something that I'm interested in and feel much more confident in after all of your wonderful comments here this afternoon as well. So thank you.
That's great. I actually, that's all wonderful. But the one thing that a lot of people don't think of that you mentioned that I think is a very good avenue to pursue is that LinkedIn thought leadership piece. Because by being I've seen several of our alums and people who aren't in our program, as ill-advised as that is, but who have done very well with that, kind of become thought leaders and professional development influencers. So yeah, that's great. And that's it for me.
Excellent. Thank you, Alex. So congratulations, Beth. This was fantastic to learn from. I am going to open it up to questions from the audience if anyone would like to ask. Oh, Tammy's hand goes up immediately. MCM alumnus Tammy Quigley, what would you like to ask?
Thank you. Beth, congratulations. We are also proud of you here at London Health Sciences Centre. And for those of you who are Beth's family members and colleagues, she's a superstar. So I just want to start with that. I'm reminded as we have this conversation around that sort of old adage, don't let any good crisis go to waste. And we have wasted crises in the past. And so I know I pulled out Dr. Flynn's paper about 11 months into the pandemic as we were looking to publish a paper when I was working in supply chain, because we were reflecting on the fact that, my goodness, we went through all that SARS and what did we do? 10, 12 years later, we didn't do anything. We reverted just, as we were speaking earlier about that sort of human behavior. And certainly I've seen it. So I have to say, I'm really hopeful given what I've seen in your results. And I did not see them until today. So that has given me a lot of hope that we actually have shifted. And so now it's around that sustainability of the shift. Certainly we want to make the shift greater, but it's the sustainability of it. And if I think back to my sort of patient safety principles around how you decrease errors, it's through, and you use the word, Terry, forcing. We call them forcing functions. And, in the safety literature, it means that you can't put a square peg in a round hole so that we don't mess up anesthetic gases, for example. So I think about how do we translate that sort of work into sustaining some of the gains that we've made as a result of this, and that we don't sort of, fall back to our SARS days where we completely ignored it and weren't prepared. So just thinking about what are those sort of forcing functions?
I think those forcing functions, Tammy, are, embedding it into practice. And, particularly with some of the healthcare colleagues that I spoke to in interviews, largely for healthcare and some other industries, we're actually still a little bit in that pandemic mode. So we're actually still operating in a bit of a crisis response. And we know that if we hit a certain number of outbreaks, or if we start to see numbers creep up in our environment, we actually might automatically enact. So I think for some organizations, it's certainly, still part of our day-to-day practice. But I think the forcing piece, and that's where that really empowering the function comes from, is as communicators, I think we have a duty to stand up in our organization as your strategic advisors to say, I don't think we should move on until we've had a chance to write these things down, embed them into practice, and put them into a checklist that maybe I give them on LinkedIn to say, here's what we do in the next crisis. So I think, I want to empower communicators to feel confident in the strategic value they bring to their organizations, to stand up and tell their leaders that this is something we have to pause and do before we can move forward as an organization from this pandemic, or a working development session, or even something like that, but really advocating for it as well.
Thank you. And congrats again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tammy.
Can I just add one thing just on to Tammy? The way you create these points, measuring points, is accountability. You write it into their job description. You measure
Yeah.
it over
See,
a period
I'm
of
with
time.
you on the measure. So I would love,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
of that checklist to say, listen, this year we're at 8. Our goal is to
Yep.
get 2 more next year and 2 more the year after, because I do performance too.
100%.
So give us the metrics. Agree.
Liv, I'm going to leave it with you as the last question or comment, but keep it brief, please, so we can move to the next phase.
Thank you, Dave. Very quickly, Beth, congratulations. Amazing research. A couple of points that trickled into my head as you were presenting was one where you noted that lack of formalization of the learnings, but then I tied that together with how many people actually leave their organization. So without writing that down, and I've noticed this too when I've been consulting with the client in the last 2 years in emergency planning and crisis planning, that there's a lot of turnover in the staff. So if it's not documented properly, you're actually losing these organizational learnings. And secondly, if you would think about reaching out and speaking on this topic to those sort of disaster planning and people who are in ops and operation and senior management, because from what I've experienced in consulting in this area is still that lack of respect for communications and that broader strategic role. You know, we're kind of brought in as the crisis communications piece, but we aren't necessarily part of that key decision making when it comes to the strategic planning. So that was my 2 points.
Yeah, I think you raise a great point, Liv. And certainly, you know, it's demonstrated in the findings where I asked communicators how their role has changed. And certainly we see a portion of respondents indicating that they've left. So with them goes all of that institutional knowledge from the pandemic. And so one of the recommendations in a more granular way that I described in my paper was creating a crisis learnings OneNote. So a Microsoft OneNote document where you're documenting learnings in real time so that if you happen to leave the organization mid-pandemic, end of the pandemic, before you have a chance to distill those learnings, it's in you know, your organizational in the moment OneNote. So that's something that we could look to integrate into practice. And then, yeah, certainly with the second point as well, you raise a very good point. It makes great sense.
Thank you, Liv. Thank you, Beth, for the answers. Terry, can you?
Yep.
So everyone, we're going to move you
Opening
to a
the room.
separate room. When you get the invite, please accept to go, and then we'll also invite you back shortly to the main room afterwards. So look for links to click on.